So as we get ready for our next speaker, Dr. Ted Bilderback, if I have a particular glow about me when I talk about Dr. Bilderback, it's because he was actually the director of the J.C. Ralston Arboretum who hired me. So it's a pretty special moment for me to get to actually introduce Dr. Bilderback. I'm Arlene Calhoun, if I haven't met you. I'm the assistant director here at the Arboretum. Mark had to step away and wasn't able to complete the program today, so his loss. But I just kind of wanted to, I guess, express my appreciation to the department and the access to information that the Arboretum has through NC State University. And I hope that you all are enjoying the program that we put together for you today. So Dr. Bilderback, education, extension, research, this guy has done it all and is doing it all. We're really lucky to have him today because he has retired. So he's sharing with you a lot of his expertise. So it's a rare opportunity to get to hear Dr. Ted Bilderback. He's a nursery extension specialist for NCSU, helping nurserymen across the state. And I have to say, even today, I still have nurserymen express their gratitude to me for what Dr. Bilderback did for them, and credit him with their nursery being so successful today. So, as I mentioned, he was the director of the J.C. Ralston Arboretum, and he's just received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Southern Nursery Association. So I hope you enjoy Dr. Ted Bilderback.
Well, thank you very much. Is my voice level okay? Can you hear me? That might be because this is the first time in 4.5 years that I've given a talk to anybody. That's how long I've been retired. I do want to thank Leaf and Williams for doing this, sponsoring this work session, and I'll also say that they've been in my backyard, and they had really some challenges to take care of, some work I needed to be done. They did a wonderful job. So you guys got my salute, and thank you very much for doing what you did. I'll also say, I feel like this is too high. Okay. I'll also say that I got here 6 months. I got to NC State 6 months after Bill Fontenot did. And so J.C. Ralston was very much my mentor as well. In fact, I sat in on a lot of the lectures J.C. had on nursery production. I was teaching a 2-year course and he was teaching a 4-year course. And I had to kind of get up to speed and kind of emulate what he did in a lot of cases. And it helped me because that ended up being my future. I did teach arboriculture, which was one of the courses that Barb teaches now also. So got a little bit of familiarity there. And I also got to say, you know what? Groundhog Day is my favorite holiday. And just like Groundhog Day being my favorite holiday, my presentation will have some notes on it. And Chris is going to send that out to you. And just like the show, Groundhog Day show, movie, you'll be able to watch it over or see it, look at it, see it, and look at it over and over again. So we'll go with that. And I really appreciate what Arlene said, but actually this is the way it was about 4.5 years ago. Ted, coming to my office at 5 o'clock, this is John Dole, he was a department head at that time. He says, that's what you say when you plan to fire people. Don't be ridiculous. Also bring your keys. So that was in the paper a few weeks back, and I just couldn't resist it. So pruning, we're talking about pruning in this session. And pruning, people have been doing that for a long, long time. As a matter of fact, Theophrastus was the first person to really talk about pruning plants, and he did that with, it was called Inquiry to Plant, it was actually called Historia Planetarium. And that was his book. It had 10 chapters in it, and you can actually find information on 9 of those chapters now that have been translated. Theophrastus, of course, lived from 371 to 287 BC. And his mentor was Aristotle, as a matter of fact. So, things on In his chapters, he wrote about the anatomy of plants. He had some information in there, and also on pruning and care of plants, and even propagation in the inquiry of plants. He talked about pruning cuts made as close to the stem as possible. That was one of the things that he's talked about. We're going to talk about that. Talk about using petroleum or tar-based paints that could be used on cuts. And then he talked about many pruning cuts were preferable to large cuts. Well, the first two things we don't do anymore. And I'll talk about why we don't do that anymore in the presentation. Many cuts, small cuts, would be preferable over large cuts if you could do it. But it's because it requires less energy from the tree to actually close wounds that you make. So we'll go with that. Now, it all got changed somewhere in about the 1980s. A guy named Alex Shigo, and he was a Forest Service plant pathologist. And I actually went to a workshop that Al Shigo did in Charlotte, and it was about 1980, 81. I got here in 77, and I was teaching an arboriculture course about pruning, and the textbook we used, P.P. Perlone's textbook, was the same textbook I had used when I was at Kansas State as a graduate student and in an arboriculture class. And so in this workshop that Alex Shigo did, he started talking to us about everything we were doing was wrong in terms of pruning and practices like using tree paints and stuff like that. Now that's pretty tough. For one thing, I've been teaching the other way for 4 years, and the industry did a lot of things that Alex Shigo said we shouldn't do in terms of breaking compartment walls. He talked about how trees actually compartmentalize and cover wounds. They're not like us where we heal and actually replace tissues. They just actually enclose and wall off where you're going to have decay. So a lot of the things he was saying was just, oh, come on. And his presentation was like a pushy salesman. And he was like, oh, come on. Well, the very next weekend after I went to the workshop that he did, I was splitting wood because I had a fireplace. I actually had a stove insert in my fireplace. And so I heated the house with wood back in those days. So I had to do a lot of wood cutting and splitting wood. And so I split a log, and it was probably about like that right there. And I split that open, and what Alex had talked about on anatomy, all the textbooks had xylem vessels going up and taking a right where a limb was, and then kind of just continuing on up here. And this was what was in all the textbooks. Nobody, I guess, had ever really looked at it. But Alex Shigo said that's not how trees are built at all. He was talking about you had xylem that came up and went that way, but you also had xylem that came up and went around and then continued on up into the tree. And just that anatomy had a lot to do with how trees walled off decay, handled wounds and stresses. And you know, having gone to that workshop, I was saying, wow, he can't be right, he's full of it. When I split that log, and that thing folded out, and I had xylem vessels going like this, and I had other xylem vessels that wrapped up and went around it, like, oh, you gotta be kidding. Because everything that he was talking about did change everything that we were doing. It meant that a lot of the kind of stuff we were doing to support trees with rods through them to protect and keep them from splitting out, we were breaking compartment walls, and we really needed to be careful about that. And everything about how we pruned had to be reconsidered. So it was a headache. How do you change everything that's been done? Well, it took about 10 years, but it pretty much has gotten to that, and it's the kind of stuff that Barb talks about now these days. But what he said, basically, without getting too far in detail, is that you can mess your trees up. You can hurt your trees if you don't know how to prune. And he talked a lot about, rather than a flush cut, which would have been in this stem tissue here, he talked about doing a branch collar cut, because there was a lot of magical things that happened in this area here in terms of wound closure and repair. And so that cut should be made there, not here. And it basically was in an equal angle with where that bark ridge was. And so the bark ridge was important, and you'd make your cut there. Now, if the bigger limb, you'd make your bottom cut here, and then you'd make a cut there so it would, bend down, the weight would go off, and you wouldn't strip bark all the way down. So it wasn't talking about that, but it was talking about really how the anatomy had a lot to do with where you ought to prune. And so this illustration shows that right here's your bark ridge, and equal to that angle is where you should make your cut after you remove the heavy part of the branch out here. It changed everything. I mean, and so 1980, 81, that's when it changed. And so he had a lot to do with how we do pruning. So there's the bark ridge, and that angle right there is where it should be. Basically right where the branch comes in and starts to widen out as it comes into the tree, it's right there is where you do that branch collar pruning. And this would have been a flesh cut. Much larger wound, much longer healing, or not healing, wound closure time. And so a smaller cut was a better cut, and in this magical area here, you'll get better wound closure. And so, again, it takes some looking about where you want to make that cut. But in any case, if you're going down the street, you see a pruning cut and some callus tissue rolling in like this, if it's a proper cut, you're probably going to get a pretty good circle. If it's not proper, you won't get this callus or wound closure occurring in a uniform manner. But this one was a pretty good cut. That would have been a large limb that came off, but apparently it was made correctly. So, you see a lot of this. You don't have to go many places without seeing branches that have been stubbed off like this. And part of what Alex Scheiger was talking about was wound closure. And when you make a stub cut like that, there's no live tissue out here. So what happens is you do not get any wound closure there because there's no live tissue to feed that callus to roll in. And so now this is always going to be open for decay. And that's not a good thing. And so if you're looking at that cut should have been made there, not out here. And it's a health thing with plants. It's just basically it's a health thing. And the tree handles it better if you'll find a branch that you can cut back to. That's maybe a third the size of where that was stubbed out. If we could have cut back down to here, and it would have been all right, because there would have been tissue to feed where that cut was made, and it would closed off. So you're looking to cut back to another branch rather than the middle of a stem, and you'll get wound closure, and the tree will do that magical thing of closing those wounds. Now, Bob showed a picture like this, and we see this done a lot on crepe myrtles. You're not going to get wound closure here, so you've got some decay. Now, crepe myrtles is a little special deal in that they flower on new wood, new shoots, and so yeah, you'll get a lot of branches come up here, and they'll get a lot of flowers on those. And what happens though is that you'll get all of these shoots coming up, and a lot of times they'll get so heavy with flowers and leaves that they just split out. Particularly if you get wind or some heavy rain or something, they'll just split out. They have no strength in that they're attached right at the end. Again, there's been no wound closure right there, and so structurally they're not strong shoots. It's the same way if it's done to oaks or maples or larger trees. It's just not good practice. Crepe myrtles, yeah, they're going to probably live, and you can do it every year if that's what you do, but it's not particularly a good practice. It's not recommended. And if you see crepe myrtles, and if you happen to look at their branch structure, and this hasn't been done, they're actually a pretty tree. And what you do is you destroy the form and the shape when this is done. But it's done, I've gotten over a long time ago. trying to scold people about this kind of stuff. But in any case, it's just that's what happens, and it's not the best practice most of the case. Now, here's the thing about horticulture. Horticulture is a science, but it's also an art. And pruning is part of the art. You have an opportunity with pruning to shape a plant, to make it look like what you want it to look like. And when I talk about pruning, definitely what I cut may not be what you would have cut, or I might not cut what you did. But it's okay. Barb mentioned they're resilient, and they are resilient. You can do a lot in terms of pruning. And so what I do might not be what you do, but one of the worst things in some cases would be that you didn't do anything. Because that means maybe it got overgrown. Maybe it was restricting walking down the sidewalk and somebody gets slapped by a branch, those kinds of things. So in that aspect, pruning is that's the art of horticulture, and you have a chance to create something. That's really what it comes down to. Or maybe you just have it done professionally. And if you have it done professionally, that's all right too. But in any case, if you're doing it yourself, we're going to talk about maybe some reasons to prune. We're going to talk about determining what you might want to prune, and a little bit about seasons of pruning also. Now, some of the why you prune, to give you some reasons that you might think about going out and pruning something, would be that you might need to direct the growth. Maybe it is a branch that's going out that's going to slap somebody if they're going down the sidewalk or come up your driveway or whatever. It was mentioned about the right plant in the right place, and a lot of times plants get planted that shouldn't be where they are because they just don't have the space to grow. Sometimes we do some things, okay, we inherited this plant, we can keep it in check in terms of size, and so controlling size is something that we do. Influence flowering and fruiting, yeah, that's certainly something we do by pruning. Maintaining the health and appearance, you can take dead wood out of plants any time, basically, any season. It's a good thing to go ahead and get dead wood out. So you certainly want to maintain the health and appearance there. When things get just huge, and you really don't have that much access, maybe you've got a spade and a medic, but maybe the plant's bigger than that to get it out of the ground, and maybe you don't have a chain and a four-wheel drive truck or something. Well, the other alternative might be rejuvenation pruning. That's where you cut things clear back to a foot or two or three, and that's many times done this time of year, and I'll show you a picture of that. Safety and clearance is obviously a big deal, and that's where lane clearing and a lot of that kind of pruning gets done, but it gets done in the home residential area as well. And I said if you the worst thing you can do is not prune sometimes, but if you really don't have any reason, you maybe need to just put the tools back. But if you can come up with a reason, then it's a good idea. Where do you start? You know, you look at a plant like that, and you say, My wife just was reading a few weeks ago about, she was reading this article, and it was said that if you ought to pull all your socks and all your underwear out of drawers, and if they don't give you joy, get rid of them. Well, maybe in landscape world, if you look at that and it's not giving you joy, you need to think about, well, do I want to get rid of it? Or is there something I can do with it? And so what you literally have to do when you see that plant and you don't know what to do, you need to just walk away from it. You need to walk back here, take a look at it, and say, okay, now it looks kind of overgrown, and it's got a lot of growth in it, and I want to bring it in, I want to bring it down. It's really got a lot of growth inside, and you really, in a lot of cases, want to open a plant up a little bit so the air can go through it and the light can go through it. Therefore, you can have foliage clear through into the canopy into the stem. And if it's too tight, too dense, maybe you just start by thinning it out and pulling in some branches and maybe pulling it down a little bit. Again, that pruning thing that we're talking about is you're not going to stud off, you're going to come down to another branch and you're going to cut. But you back away, you look, kind of figure out what you're going to do, and then you go from there. Now, I've been doing these pruning workshops for a long time, and people just are excited about me doing it. Look at these people, how excited they are. They are just thrilled that I'm there. Yeah. So in any case, people are excited, and I'm glad you're excited about me talking to you. Let's go on from here. So you have some choices to make, and there's a couple of different ways you can prune. Certainly, you can shear, and the decision is to shear or not to shear, and we'll talk about why there's a decision there. And one of the reasons that there's a decision there is once you start shearing a plant, you really have a hard time going back natural. With things, you pretty much change its natural form. And so that's one of the reasons. And if you start shearing plants, get used to it. You're going to keep doing it, and probably several times in a year, and years and years and years. So, how do we shear? That's out of focus. I'm sorry about it, but you get the idea. We might shear with a gas-powered shear, and there's also electric-powered shears that you can use, and you're just basically clipping all the tips. You're keeping it in a certain size, and you're getting rid of all the errant shoots on it. And it's how just a whole lot of pruning is done in our landscapes these days. This has been sheared. It might not be too late. We've got some errant branches here. But the more you shear, the more of a dense canopy you get out here on the edge, and the less opportunity you have to have growth down in. So you get to a point where it's going to be that size, and if you tried to get it to be smaller, you're back to bare stems. So that's one issue with shearing. As an illustration here, we have diagrams showing thinning and heading back versus what happens when you shear. When you're thinning and heading back, thinning is you're actually taking branches at the base or stems at the base out. You're opening this up so that air and light can get through it. You can have growth inside the canopy of it. Heading back, basically you're taking some of these interior branches out, crossing branches, branches that are growing parallel to each other and trying to occupy the same space. So you're looking for those, and you basically then, again, have accomplished opening this up. So light and air, birds can fly through it. Pruning this way with where you just cut the tops off, you get all those shoots, just like I was telling you with that crepe myrtle. You get all those shoots up the top. And that's what you're going to get. You're going to get a very dense canopy. Even on the sides, it doesn't show it so much, but even on the sides, you're going to get such a dense canopy. All the growth will be out here on the top, and it'll get so there isn't any new growth on the inside because it doesn't get any light and it doesn't get any air through. And air is important because a lot of plants actually get some fungal issues, mildews and leaf spots and all kinds of things such as that. And if you've got good light penetration, if you've got air moving through it, it reduces that problem. The other thing is you get this growth all out here, but then because all the growth's out here, you cut holes in plants. Now that might be a good place for a bird to fly in, make a nest, and maybe you like habitat, but in any case, aesthetic-wise, it may not be what you want. And so that's what you're going to get. All the growth's going to be out there. And again, the only thing this plant can do is get bigger, bigger, and bigger. You're not going to pull it back in size without going to the rejuvenation technique. So that happens on whatever kind of plant you're talking about. If you're shearing it, you're liable to cut a hole in it. And, you know, again, here's the art in pruning. Here's the art of pruning. You can create your own forms. You can create boxes, you can create bottles, and you can create balls. You know, it's right there, and you can be as creative as you want. Shearing is one way, and you can be very creative. You can also create a whole family of marshmallows. All you gotta do is just come out here with your trimmer and zip, 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 and that's what we see a lot. And so it works. Sometimes it's just ugly. Forsythia, don't shear forsythia. I mean, that's really ugly. Forsythia ought to look like that. And you know, after they flower, and that's the clue on most flowering shrubs, after they flower, you can come in here, you can pull this back by coming back to a branch or even a bud and cutting at it and pulling the sides down on the errant shoots. But at least right now, they're pretty when they have that kind of natural form. And shearing it just kind of loses the aesthetic. You can do some pretty amazing things shearing, and a lot of the formal gardens that you'll go to, they do some amazing things by shearing, but believe me, it's a lot of work. They got people doing this all the time, and it's as soon as you get done on one side, you start back and do it again. And you can do it with trees too. It just doesn't have to be shrubbery. You can do it with trees, and it just takes a lot of time and effort. It's expensive in these formal gardens. You can be creative yourself, and you can do a lot of creative things, but sometimes your neighbors won't like it. So be careful with what you do, because your neighbors may get upset. So, in talking about what you need for tools, you know, these are the hand tools that you can do a lot of things with. A pair of loppers, a saw, a pair of pruning shears. You can do a lot. If you're so inclined to do some selective pruning. And there's other pieces of equipment that if you've got taller things, you've got a long handle pruning shear, you've got a long handle lopper, you've got long handled saws, and you can do a lot of things. A lot of people have these kind of pieces of equipment. Again, you get them for shearing. You can get these with a power cord on it, and I think you can even get them battery operated now, 40 volts. So there's that kind of equipment too. So these are kind of the tools of trade that you might be doing pruning on a residential basis with, that you might have. Getting into why pruning? Well, we're going to direct growth, control the size, and safety clearance in this. There's a pyracantha, and actually I think this is a thornless pyracantha. But the ones I work with at my church, that's an espalier, believe me, they are not thornless. And you better have some good thick leather gloves, because they'll hurt you. I used to use pyracantha as a plant in our research studies, where along with Bill, we did potting mix studies and fertilizer and irrigation studies. And pyracantha is a very good indicator plant. The more you watered it, the better your growth you got. So we did irrigation studies. We were looking at different ways to apply and things. My technician, who only worked for me a short period of time, she worked with me 23 years. She told me after about the 15th year, if you keep working with pyracantha, I'm quitting. So, pyracantha, for direct growth, obviously you have to, because it's along the sidewalk. It's got to be, in this case, it's being sheared, and that's probably the right thing to do. And it's controlling size, not only width, but height, because it has to fit that location. And safety and clearance, I've already talked about the thorns. If people got into the thorns, you'd be having a lawsuit. And so it's a nice looking plant. Direct growth, again, control and clearance. I've got a hedge row here, or actually a screen, and that's laurel petalum, and that's going to get out here and start slapping people. And so you can reach in there and pull a lot of those branches out. Commercial companies are generally going to shear it, and that probably works all right. But these are the places where shearing can work, where you definitely got a clearance and safety issue, and you can maintain a nice look. So shearing, you know, is probably a better way, at least on time, for what you're going to put in on a bid or something like that. That shearing is probably how that's going to get handled. But Here again is another sidewalk situation. Conifers don't do very well if you have to bring them way back in size. That's not gonna regenerate growth. That's gonna be ugly from here on. And it's gonna force people, if you're looking at aesthetics, they're gonna have to replace this. Because there's probably not gonna be enough growth to close that kind of cutting back into dead wood off. So that becomes an issue with shearing. Whereas if this had been maintained where they came in here and took a branch out, and there was another branch there, and if they'd have done it by hand, took a lot more trouble. But in this case, it would have been something that would have not required them to replace after 10 years or so, that screen, landscape screen. So, some things just, take a little more time, take a little more work, take a little more trouble. Where I'm going with this is to tell you that directed pruning, where you're actually identifying what needs to be cut, it's going to take more work. And so, it takes more work. We start having to do that thing where we back away, we look and say, okay, what are some things that need to be done? This plant's actually on a frame, it's failure, probably needs to come back quite a bit, so we need to start working, pulling it back, where you actually go in there and identify a branch or a shoot that needs to come out, take it out, point where another branch is, you bring it back in, you don't like that, you come back here, that kind of thing, where you just reduce, but you reduce it and pull it in by identifying what you're going to do. You're maintaining a natural form when you do that. You're allowing the light and the air to get in, and you can be creative in terms of what you're doing. The way you can be creative. If you need to direct the growth, you look at this branch and say, well, you know what? I'd cut that one out. It's going to push all that energy either here or there. I can cut that out, and I'm going to force this limb, this branch, to go that way. Or if I took that out because it's going to grow towards the center, I can say, okay, I'm going to let that shoot go, or I'm going to let this one come outside. You're directing the growth, and you're identifying how you want that plant to grow, in what space. So if I cut this, I'm directing that the energy is going to go into that branch. But I'm cutting it back so it will. And I'm actually, therefore, creating the form that I want, and I'm getting what I want in terms of where I want it to grow, the direction I want it to go, and so forth. So those are the kinds of things that you look for. You actually step back and look and say, this shoot here is growing out, clear out off the edge of the canopy. So I'm going to cut that. I'm going to put the energy in there. Same thing here. You're selective pruning. That's what it is. Now, this is viburnum, but a lot of plants do that. If you have an upright shoot, it is twice as vigorous as anything else close to it. You better want that, because that thing's going to go clear to the top of the plant. So you don't want to take vertical shoots out if you can, unless there's a reason to leave them. You get a lot of shrubbery that will form multiple terminals, leaders. And you've got to decide, you don't have to, you can let this thing do that. But if you do, you're just going to have this not particularly aesthetic looking plant. So you get in there, you decide who's going to be boss, and then you take the others back to a point. So that's it. You probably do want to come down to one shoot. And even that one shoot, you may want to take the tip out of it so it will branch. Because if you don't take the tip out, it'll keep on going on up. Otherwise, it'll branch. I think I can show that here. Nellie Stevens holly is renowned for this, where they'll throw up a big shoot, and I worked mostly with the nursery industry during my career, and working with the nursery industry, they wanted a packed plant. They didn't want a lot of shoots, but if they didn't take the tip out of a terminal after they'd taken the laterals back, they got this big old open gap in the middle of the plant, and nobody wanted to buy that. So they had to come in basically and pull these back and probably do it with some kind of piece of equipment. I'm doing it with a hand piece of equipment there. But even though, and I should have taken this one out, but I pulled them back and I left one dominant terminal, but I took the tip out of it, and it'll branch. And that's the kind of stuff you want to do. You don't have to necessarily have a Nellie R. Stevens or a Shindo viburnum that's big. This is what you do on smaller shrubbery as well. Again, what you're looking for is inside branches, maybe branches that go across that are plugging up the middle, but you're directing the growth, you're improving the health and the appearance of the plant. Anything that's rubbing, I call those fiddlers, like fiddling, and they're going to create a wound on one another. And so you take that. I'm taking that out here, but actually maybe I should have taken it out down here, or even at the base where it starts. But you're looking for that kind of interference. Anything coming to the center, you probably want to think about taking it out. Any of these kind of shoots, but particularly anything that's rubbing, you definitely want to get them out, because that's creating a wound, an injury, and that can create further problems. Deadwood, yeah, take that out anytime. So if you got a bit stub there, take it out back where there's live growth, and that's something that you definitely want to do. Roses, I don't know how to lead you on this. I'll tell you, on knockout roses, I end up cutting them back pretty hard about twice a year, in the summertime and in the winter. And again, it's something that's got a thorn, you want a pair of gloves. Knockouts are very vigorous, and a lot of hybrid tea types of roses are. You want to make sure you cut the old canes out that are decayed or not very good looking, or maybe have some wounds on them. You want to cut them out. A lot of times I'll come out here on a lot of roses, and I'll come up here and find the second outward facing bud, and they're hard to see, and I couldn't try to take pictures of buds, and I couldn't get it when I was holding it and holding the shears or something. But in any case, you'll see outward facing buds, and a lot of times I'll come up to the second or the third outward facing bud, and I'll cut it above that. And that's where how I do a lot of roses. This has become quite an issue. With our church, we're pretty much raising all of the large shrubbery. It's a safety issue. About 10 years ago, we had somebody living in the Nellie R. Stevens hollies that had foliage that went clear to the ground. When there were hangers in there and clothes and all kinds of stuff. It's becoming an issue institutionally. We're getting afraid of ourselves, quite honestly. But even if we are, we got to know about it. So raising shrubbery, large shrubs in the tree form is becoming quite a popular thing to do these days for safety kinds of issues. So we see that, make them tree forming, it works, it's okay. But that's a safety and appearance type of pruning. Why pruning for flowers? After the flowers is the general rule for flowering. If it flowers in winter or spring, prune after the flowering. If they flower in summer or fall, prune when dormant, because they're going to flower on new shoots. And so kind of get into some examples. A lot of camellias, sasanquas, or well, just the whole group. Okay, which one?
The one right over this to tell you to put that?
That one?
Yeah.
Okay, it's an easy rule. You basically prune after they flower.
Oh, okay.
And if they flower in the spring, like I'm going to show you on azalea or camellia, the camellias bloom say November to February, even March. You prune after that. With azaleas and even rhododendrons, they're going to be later in the spring, and you prune them after they flower. You don't want to cut. The key is don't cut flower buds off. If that's the aesthetic part, why you've got them in your landscape. So prune after they flower, and again, if they flower in the summer or fall, that you prune after they flower, which in a lot of cases is when they're dormant. Again, this is Sasanqua camellia. And if there were japonicas, they bloom a little later. This is probably blooming November. And then after that, the kinds of things you prune, well, through the summer, they threw up a lot of shoots. And it's not aesthetic. I didn't cut them off because there might be some flower buds up there. But now, after these get done flowering, I'm going to go ahead and trim. I've got to keep it off the sidewalk. And so I'm going to pull them in that way. I'm going to reach in there and I'm going to prune out the longer shoots. I'm going to go up there and I'm going to come in and prune a lot of that back down to the height that I need to maintain. Azaleas are kind of the same game. After they bloom is usually May or June, and we've got plants that have grown into each other. Maybe I want them to separate them out, and so I'm going to prune them after they flower. Now, if those are really too big, you can do azaleas like I'm going to talk about on rejuvenation pruning. Fact is, most broadleaf evergreens and even deciduous types of shrubbery, most of it you can cut clear back, and I'll get to that in just a second. But junipers or most conifers, you're not going to be able to do it. Here's a good example of why you might want to prune after they flower. Get these plants separated so that they have their own entity again. But you do it after they flower. Here's a couple of things. Encore azalea are remontant bloomers. They bloom, they continue to bloom. They have flower buds that bloom all through the summer. This is my backyard, and this red azalea blooms all summer long, and even in the fall. This picture was taken in, I think, in November or October. So picking a time to prune that, even if it's dormant, it's still got flower buds on. It's just a hard time. You'd limit your pruning on a plant like that. Maybe something that's just too long or too just out of the symmetry of the plant. But otherwise, you probably don't prune that much. Same way with the Japanese maple. Japanese maples kind of occupy kind of a lofty position in the landscape, and most of the time there's not a lot of pruning we need to do. There's deadwood in them, and so a lot of times you'll take that out when they're dormant. But unless it's got a limb that just doesn't look right, destroys the form of it, I don't do a lot of pruning on Japanese maples. They're just an elite plant. They may have some dissymmetric types of branches or limbs, but Japanese maples have that place in the landscape that what would be grotesque for a lot of plants is just plain picturesque in Japanese maple. That's just the way it is. That's what, and it's not a mistake that J.C. Ralston Arboretum's signature plant is Japanese maple. Hydrangeas, again, who knows? I throw my hand up a lot of the times, but we've got a lot of them that are remontant bloomers, and it's hard to pick a time to prune them. If you got branches that go kind of like this, you maybe take them out, but by and large, maybe you don't need to do such hard or frequent pruning on them. That's just kind of my take on it. What do we got? And again, this Groundhog Day, you get my speaker notes at the bottom of these slides when you get the PDF on. So you don't have to write real fast. And that picture, by the way, and this picture, I think came from J.C. Ralston Arboretum. Gardenias, you prune them on new growth. So if you want to prune them back in the wintertime, pull them back into shape, size, you can do it because they don't bloom until they got new shoots, and it's going to be in summer.
Right now?
Yep. Yeah, they don't have any flower buds on them right now, so you can do that. You can go ahead and prune them now and get them in the form you want. They'll kick out new shoots and they'll bloom on those. So that's gardenias. There is this thing, season of pruning, and it is best to avoid pruning at stress periods. Stress periods would be when they're trying to dedicate a lot of their energy and resources to another process. And that would be like deciduous trees at bud break. Yeah, I'm not saying you can't cut, one shoot or one branch or something, but extensive pruning at that time is not a good time. And leaf drop, when they're actually closing off where the leaves are attached and dropping that, they're using energy for that. So it's not a great time to do pruning. The other time about pruning is birches, beeches, maples, and actually dogwoods too, I think. When you prune them this time of year in this was done yesterday. I did that yesterday for this picture. They bleed. Now that's probably not fatal, but it sure bothers a lot of people. I used to get calls about, oh, I pruned and bleeding, or dripping sap everywhere. Well, the sap's coming up this time of year. Now they're pushing it up from the roots into the top. They're getting ready to go, and so they're gonna bleed. It's not fatal, but a lot of people get kind of upset about it, and so you might do that. And then Barb mentioned something else I want to mention, and another stress thing that might not be the best time to do. And yeah, I understand if a tree's got a screwed up canopy and you inherited it, that you probably need to establish a single leader. But pruning at transplanting is not the greatest time to prune hard on plants either. You'd like to let them get established for maybe a month and then do some of your pruning at that point. Question?
I was reading about roses pruning, and it says to use glue on where you snip. If you agree with that, or?
I don't know. The question was on roses, would you put a sealant on the pruning cuts? I probably wouldn't. I don't think it's worth it. Yeah, I suppose if you may get a little dieback on that tip. But the other thing that was wrong that Theophrastus said to do, that Shigo said not to do, was that it traps moisture down in that stem, and that's just one of the ingredients for decay to occur. So I probably wouldn't do it. Maybe people that are really rose people think there's a way that they ought to do that, and I'm not going to make a big stand on it, but it's just not what I would do. Question there.
Yes, so this picture right here that you said you took yesterday, so is it bleeding because the sap is coming up? Is that?
Yeah, this is a red maple, one of Barb's favorites. But it's a red maple, and I went up there and I did this intentionally to show it. It was nasty of me to do that. What?
My question is, we're February 1st, so we're in the winter.
Sap's coming up. If you look, these buds on red maples are already starting to swell. We're getting ready to go. And unfortunately, well, we haven't had the winter that's a problem, but a year ago, when we had all that warm weather early in January, and then we got that single-digit stuff in, I believe it was early March, man, that was devastating, because these things were ready to go. Crepe myrtles went out in nurseries like crazy, but these things are ready to go, and when you get that kind of cold, it's kind of like, ask the Arboretum crowd about what happens to magnolias. They like to bloom early too.
Or like is summer the only time to be pruning them now?
Late fall, right after leaf drop, and summer is a better time. Now again, this isn't fatal. This is just, bothers people. Okay, we are going to get to this last section here now. Rejuvenation pruning, and we do a lot of that, and we do most of it now. February is the time that a lot of people come here and say, this thing is just overgrown, I'm going to cut this thing back, and I'm going to make a new plant. And basically, you can do it. Now, if you do this in February, your plant will look ugly the least amount of time, because you're going to fill this thing up with new shoots. Sometimes that's what you want, and sometimes it would have been better to have done it in the summer, because you wouldn't get as much growth, and it'll be ugly for 2 years. But it just comes down to whether you can come back and cut the shoots off of it that form off of this by midsummer. So what we're doing is we're cutting something clear back. This is dwarf Burford holly. This is at my church, and these things were up and scraggly, and they were cut back, and you can see the size of those stems, and you can see that they do regrow and come back. The Arboretum's been doing the Nellie R. Stevens hollies back here, and we're talking about shoots or stems the size of my leg and arm. Cut those back to here, and by midsummer they're new growth, because they've got such a root system under them. They got so much drive with energy and nutrients that it works. But then it doesn't mean you're done. You got to keep after it. It'll be right back, come back again. Some things don't work real well. Boxwoods are very slow. You can cut them back. They're one of those broadleaf evergreens. You can cut them back, but it's probably going to be 5 years before they look decent. My neighbor did this, and they're still ugly. But in any case, he's got new growth coming, but it takes a long time on boxwood after you've done rejuvenation pruning. Most broadleaf evergreens are gonna work, most deciduous. This is, sorry about that. It's barberry. We'll get back to where we want. Barberry and some holly, that may be yopon. Looks like that's shingle viburnum there. So a lot of things, you can cut them back really hard and they would work. Other things you're doing that are pruning that maybe you don't think about being pruned, but most of the grasses, your clump grasses, this is the time of year to prune them back. So I like to get them pruned back before we get a lot of new growth up in them. Liriope also, I cut it back. A lot of times I cut it back in fall. Hellebores, cut them back, cut the old foliage off. They're flowering now, or starting to flower now, and they'll be more attractive if you cut some of the old foliage off. The other thing that we've seen a lot of times in North Carolina is winter damage. And sometimes it can look just kind of yellowed out plants because it got too cold and basically chlorophyll got stopped getting replaced in these, so they kind of yellow out, but they'll probably recover. Other times we get desiccation, winter kill, in terms of they just dry out. We had an event in North Carolina in the fall of 1983 where we hadn't had very much cold. We got a December week where, and it had been predicted, we knew it was coming. We got a center week when it was single-digit temperatures, 8 degrees or so, 40-mile-an-hour winds, and it stayed that way for several days. Well, it was so cold that the roots couldn't work to bring water up into them. And with broadleaf evergreens, they just browned out, and the arboretum was just brown. So that's actually one of the winter protection. That's when J.C. Ralston discovered a plant called Davidson Hardy ligustrum, because they didn't die, but everything else around it did. But in any case, that's desiccation injury. The plant it was just so cold that the roots couldn't work. It was bright sun, it was high winds, and they just dried things out. The thing that we also see, and we see that more than we see these other things really, this is frost damage. I mean, that's just freeze damage. Tissue, the tips started growing and got too cold and they got frosted out. You sometimes ought to prune that out, but you know, maybe if you don't, it's not going to be a big deal because you're going to get new shoots.
Would it have helped if you had watered those plants?
It would have helped. It would have helped. But in most landscapes, you probably don't get to their hose has been frozen for, you know, if you didn't roll it up and that kind of thing. But and with nurseries, that's one of the things I did push, that they had to get water. We had a big cold front, a lot of wind, bright skies, cold temperatures. Water would help, mostly on container stuff. If they could get it watered, they could save a lot of stuff.
What about putting the sheet over them, blanket
It would help with desiccation. Cold temperatures, if you can keep the sheets on them, that's the other thing. 40-mile-an-hour winds, it's hard to keep things on. This was earlier this year. You can see you get breakage, and so that's an issue. You're going to have to come in there and do some pruning as well. Misshapes some plants. That's skip laurel, and they're all weighed down with snow, and it's probably we may have to do some pruning to get them to stand up. And the other thing that I do, I've got some arborvitae. I think these are emerald arborvitaes. And if I just don't do something with these, they're going to split like a banana. I take twine, just jute twine, get a dollar store, packs of 3. I don't know if you've ever seen them or not. And I just tie them off and go zip, 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 like that. And I keep them from splitting like a banana, because otherwise they're going to get deformed, and it's not a good thing. Ice, snow, even wind can cause issues there. Well, this brings us to the question, why you're here. Why you moved to Raleigh, North Carolina? Is it that you got tired of the 2 feet of snow? And that's what that is 2 feet of snow. So, that's all I got. Yeah,
I have a mature dogwood that has a cavity, you know, or branch that's collecting water. Is there any way to prolong its life a little?
it's not gonna die from that. Going back to Shigo's compartmentalization, it's walled that off. Now,
I mean, it's
I
down
don't like cavities in trees because they collect water and feed us. And so, you know, I don't know, I can't really tell you to fill it with anything, but it's not hurting the health of the plant. The plant has already walled it off. It's just that it's a reservoir for varmints and for mosquitoes. Question?
We've got a house in, it does have an extremely overgrown, what was the one, I'm blanking out, crepe myrtle. And so, in that case, like, I can't really find a sideways branch down low enough. Is that what, when you would do the genetical?
You probably come back, you clear down to where you can. If it, but, you know, there is such a thing as just taking some of the weight off. If you've got some branches up there, and that's what people do a lot of times when they're worried about trees being over their house. They'll actually have an arborist company come in and thin that so that there's not so much weight, particularly on that side that go to the house. Well, the same thing is, if you've got anything up there that you can pull back, if you pull maybe a third of it out, cut it, that's good. Otherwise, the only other choice really is to cut the base. Or you can do like, you can cut it off just in mid-stem and you're gonna get all those new shoots. And that's gonna destroy the form.
So, what do you do with the crepe myrtle? I mean, I cut it like those pictures are. What do I do with it this year then?
Well, again, there depends on if there's stems like that or if there's stems like that. You can actually just cut the ones off that are towards the inside that are gonna go up and interfere in the center. And you can actually, since you do have shoots here, you might get a little bit of closure on that stub so you won't get dieback, and you can actually kind of put a natural canopy back in. But it's on every one of those shoots, and I would be taking the ones that grow that are more on the interior, and then all of those up there, I probably would be heading them back as well, so that you don't have so much growth out, and you just eventually get. I did this. I'm usually at my church in charge, and I've got with that responsibility for a while, and somebody said, "I'm gonna prune them here," and they did. But I worked my way around it where I've got a natural form in them again, but it takes years. Huh? Yeah, sweet box. Again, it's something that I would never do a real fast pruning on them in terms of everything at once, but I shoot it and I bring it back in where you most need and work at it for a couple of years. That's what I would do. That's me. I don't know if that's the right answer.
Maybe one more. Is it then for
Juniper and conifers, about any time, quite honestly. Particularly now is a good time, and then again, I pull them back shoot by shoot.
big hand of applause?
Yep, and we'd like to thank all of our speakers, so one more round of applause. All of our speakers. And Lincoln Lynn for sponsoring this free event. Thank you very much. I couldn't do it without them. So if you enjoyed the programming today, remember we do have our winter symposium, and I don't know that we've mentioned a topic on that, but it's kind of gardening winter interest. So if you want to learn more about that specific topic, we have 3 wonderful speakers. You can get the member rate if you register today. Remember,
Before you leave.
Before you leave today.
Not later online.
Remember, our garden is open every day, free, so I hope that whether you get involved in our programming or become a member, that you will at least come back and enjoy yourselves in this beautiful space that's free and open to you. So thank you for coming. It was a pleasure to meet all of you, and so come on back. Oh.